Sisu and these qualities, they're all as factory settings within every single human. And that's where our mindset comes into play. And positivity, for a great part, is a mindset. Is like, what do we cultivate? What are the thoughts? And everything to me always leads back to our thinking.
Welcome to Ultra Habits. Here, we go under the hood with our guests to unpack the minutiae and to understand what processes and systems they engage or research that result in ultra enhanced living.
Hey guys, it is RJ Singh here from the Ultra Habits podcast, and I want to thank you for joining us for another show today. Today we have Emilia Lahti on our episode of the Ultra Habits podcast. Emilia is an awarded Finnish educator, author, and the founder and CEO of Sisu Labs, a company that helps people in organizations and teams access the full expression of their life force. She's an international presenter on the topics of courage, compassion, creativity, and authentic relating and teamwork. And she works one-on-one with professionals and executives committed to excellence and leadership as a pathway to awakening. Emilia holds previous master's degrees in social psychology and applied positive psychology, the latter which she obtained under the mentorships of Drs. Martin Seligman and Angela Duckworth. She's also a certified ultra running coach. In her PhD, Emilia is pioneering the research on the Finnish construct of Sisu, which is about accessing latent reserves of energy in the face of extraordinary adversity. She's also the author of the upcoming book, Gentle Power, A Revolution in How We Think, Lead, and Succeed. Emilia's work has been featured by The New Yorker, Business Insider, BBC, and Forbes, among others. Hope you enjoy the show, guys. Let me know what you think. Keen for your feedback as always. So, Emilia, I was hoping that you could define Sisu for us. What is it? And can you contrast between Sisu and concepts like grit, resilience, and perseverance, please?
Yeah, thanks, RJ. And it's so beautiful to be here with you in this moment and to talk about my favorite subject. So, yeah, Sisu is a curious concept. It adds something to our dialogue, in not just in an academic sense. I'll distinguish between those concepts, which is more kind of like in the research part where we want to draw these lines, but also just in personal use. Sisu can really give us this conceptual handle, so to speak, to grab when we're going into and going through some really, really tough challenges in our lives. So Sisu is an ancient Finnish concept. Its roots go back hundreds of years. And the etymology of the word, it comes from a word sisus. So Sisu is spelled S-I-S-U. And then you add an S to the end and it makes sisus, which literally means the intestines or the gut or the interior, of something. And so Sisu refers to this kind of fortitude and quality that resides very, very deep within us. And you could call it guts. And it is a strength that we draw upon in moments when we feel that we have gone through our observed mental or physical capacities, when we feel that we have come to the end limit of what we think we're capable of doing. And then when we stay with it a little longer, we don't give up. What often happens, and I hear people reporting this, and I think this is probably familiar to most of your listeners, is that there's almost this like extra spare tank of energy that is unlocked or found. And the peculiar thing with Sisu is that it's exactly in the moments of adversity or crisis or tragedy where we will forge a pathway into this power or force. So it's not something that we would be tapping into on randomly on regular days, or you don't get a parking spot near enough to the grocery store and you feel a little bit bothered by it, So Sisu is not that stuff. Sisu is really going into the dark forest, and when things are really, really hard. You could call it the dark night of the soul sometimes. It doesn't need to be that intense necessarily, but it is an intestinal internal fortitude that we can tap on when it seems like there's nothing else we have left within us. And so the most significant difference between these other concepts that you mentioned, RJ, is that those concepts are all they have to do with our cognitive qualities and reserves. So they're more to do with willing something into being or willing our way through something. So grit, which is researched by my previous mentor, Angela Duckworth, who is a super, super brilliant scholar, research professor at University of Pennsylvania. And she has pioneered the research on grit. And grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. So it's putting in the work day in, day out. You have a goal, you put in the needed action and effort to make it a reality. And so it has to do with having some kind of an end goal. It has to do with having some kind of a reward or a vision at the end. With Sisu, it's not so much about, okay, there's this reward at the end. Sisu is really about forging something out of nothing, or it's about making it through the day or making it through the breath or the moment, or the heartbeat. Perseverance, sister concept, it's actually quality that goes is part of grit as well. So it's about being able to endure on the long run, go through setbacks, go through frustration when it feels like, this is really not, that the road is very, very long. So you could say that Sisu begins where perseverance ends. That's one way of kind of looking at it. Plus that perseverance is a cognitive quality. Sisu is more like what I would call it, as having researched it now since 2013, early year, is Sisu is more like the embodied or somatic equivalent of mental toughness. So it is that visceral, intestinal toughness that we have. And then we have other concepts like hardiness as well, which again relates to more like how we consciously process things. And resilience, which is a very interesting concept and topic in these times, is our quality and ability to bounce back from adversity. So before we get our head back above the surface, which is kind of that quality of resilience, to bounce back and adapt to difficulty and tragedy and trauma, underneath, before we get back to the surface, there's this huge effort that has to be made that we go back to the surface. It's that we're still not quite there. So Sisu is that power that allows us to get closer enough to the surface that we can pop our head back there, and then we can engage again, back to these like resilience and perseverance. So Sisu is a place where we visit. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, it's a beautiful summation, Emilia, and I know that with language, it can be quite difficult to articulate subtleties, especially when you're translating something from Finnish to English. And I think that was beautifully articulated. Something that's come up for me right now actually is what would your view be on Sisu's relationship to flow?
So I've looked into that, especially in the beginning part of the research, and it felt already then like a very organic and natural connection. And it's Csikszentmihalyi's concept that he has researched pretty much all of his research career. And I got to meet Mihai last year at his home university in California. And so kind of the closest connection point I put there is that the concept of flow that Mihai is talking about, it also relates to this almost like a mysterious quality that we humans have, that we're able to go into a place where time disappears, where we align our skills with the task at hand, but not just kind of like, here's what I can do, but you really take it to the furthest end of your comfortable way of doing it while yet challenging yourself. So you're not going to be in flow if it's too hard, where you're really having to go into that like heavy lifting internally. But also you're not going to get into flow if the task is too easy. So there's similarity there with Sisu, that Sisu also carries this mysterious quality. to it. So that's where the link is with the mystic part of it, that it's really accessing a quality within us where, how to best put words into this, where we are able to draw from something within us that is greater than we would normally be able to kind of express, I guess.
Would you say the external environment needs to pull that out of us, or we can spark that proactively? Stephen Kotler, because we're talking about flow, has this view that we could ignite flow in basic tasks. I tend to disagree, and to your point around it, he talks about base jumpers going into a state of flow. Well, I would surmise that they're in a heightened state of awareness because of their survival instinct kicking in, and maybe something prehistoric is going on there. What's your view on whether or not Sisu can be activated purposefully, or does the external environment need to draw that out of us?
The answer is kind of a yes and a no. So, because it is partially involuntary, it's like, because it has to do with so much of our the fears that we carry with us. It has to do with our previous experiences. If we could ignite Sisu, Sisu on demand, I think that's kind of one of those $1 billion questions. Then we would kind of turn into gods and goddesses, right? If we could just like snap our fingers and hear Sisu, this intestinal explosive fire in the belly, we could do anything. So it doesn't quite seem to go like that. But what happens is that ordinary men and women, girls and boys, are able to express Sisu in those tough moments. And I think part of that, where it is somehow invoked by our actions, is that we can also consciously put ourselves in situations where we know that we're going to be challenged. For example, in the past, I've done all kinds of excursions to test Sisu and really research it from within, and running very long lengths, long ultra marathons and things. So I know I will be challenged, and I know that the moment of Sisu will come. So it's me allowing myself to be brave enough to go into a space where I'm challenged. But even a more interesting part to this, I'll just add, is, and what I'm really passionate about, is the Sisu that not only lives within you and within me, but it's the Sisu that lives in the in-between space of you and I, and from research into psychological safety, for example, we know that from Barbara Fredrickson, who has researched positive emotions such as trust, curiosity, joy. But what she has noticed is that when people experience these emotions, their cognitive capacities, they broaden and they build. So we're able to access more into that cognitive strata that we have. And the same thing goes with these qualities that, for example, perseverance, grit, and I would put Sisu there as well, is that when we feel a certain level of safety, when we are with humans who know that they are going to support us, that they have our back, it adds something to us where we are more likely to take the crazy talent challenge. We're more likely to be able to tap into something within us when we feel like we have no breaths left. If you think of Viktor Frankl, who wrote the beautiful book Man's Search of Meaning, he went through extreme experiences at the Auschwitz concentration camp. And what he found, that those men and women who had some kind of a sense of purpose, maybe it was that they were in their heart still longing and having such faith that they will see their beloveds, that gave them that strength to go through extreme situations.
You're talking about faith, trust, and hope?
I'm bundling them as positive emotions, but yes, to be more specific, I think hope, for example, is powerful. It's the spark plug of all action. If we don't have hope, it's almost like we're lacking oxygen from the fire.
That's an interesting point, because I can definitely see how psychological safety and that striving towards hope can give us that second wind. I would
Mm,
ask on the flip side, in a scenario where our back's against the wall and we feel there is no way through but by our own design, could
mm.
that actually spark Sisu too? Because it's a survival mechanism that might kick in, or what's your view on that?
Absolutely. Yes, you are there at the heart of it. So Sisu is the most default setting there is in a human. When we look back at our collective history and how we have overcome and survived, it's really that coding in our DNA, in our psyche, that pulls us to take the next step and next breath. I mean, life does not wither away easily, as we have seen so many times.
It's such an interesting piece because reflecting on myself, I would say that somewhere along the line, I became addicted to the feeling of being within adversity. And on the
Mm,
flip side, I think, and I wonder what your view is on this. I think you would agree
mm,
that on the flip side, we, is for those of us that kind of like to put ourselves through adversarial situations, part of the journey may also be becoming comfortable being kind of not engaged in a process like that. So what I'm saying is, what I've
mm,
found is when I'm not engaged in adversarial situations, I start to feel like I'm not truly living. And that I think is a problem. I think for me personally, the journey has been also about becoming okay with the ordinary and mundane
yeah.
parts of life. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, RJ, it makes so much sense. And I've gone through both sides of the spectrum and kind of having to reconcile with, how to integrate those two polarities in me. And I think, most people who would listen to a podcast called Ultra Habits maybe have, a tendency and the ability to endure quite demanding situations in their lives. It's a capacity and a reserve, and we differ in our expression of that. So most of my life that I lived, I've always kind of had this beautiful quality that I don't look into the troubles and I don't look into what could go wrong, but I go into the excitement and the beauty and awe of the challenge, which has allowed me to do all kinds of extraordinary things and live through them and learn from them. But I also noticed at some point that, you know, why does it have to be so extreme? What are the other polarities and the other polarity and the other sides to me? And I think it also is it's partially tied to our personality. It's tied to our temperament. It's tied to developmental phases. As I am approaching 40, I notice that there's more curiosity and more priority in my life going into finding ground and finding root,
Mm.
which of course doesn't mean that I wouldn't do such intense things, but the quality of those intense things tends to shift. And then the challenge becomes, how do I sit with myself in silence and sometimes just observe what is going on around me? And sometimes, the most courageous thing and the thing that takes the most sisu is, for example, to quit something. you know in a in a culture like I am from Finland, we grew up with this concept of sisu, and it's weaved into our national psyche that you have to power on, and if you show a sign of weakness, it's kind of sometimes influences your um witness status in a negative way. So that's the downside of sisu as well, which is why I always speak so much about the power and necessity of benevolence and compassion, because we can't build societies where it's all about powering on and pushing, because we are not machines. We are humans who have feelings, who have layers, multitudes. And by sometimes saying no to a task that we have started, and there's a lot even invested, but when we start realizing that it's hurting us, it's hurting me, it's hurting my family, I'm forcing it. When the power turns to force, that's a tricky spot because we don't always recognize it, but it's a key moment also to our growth, to be able to be mature Sisu warriors, not just splashing out that power everywhere, but really knowing how to use it and when to use it. And that's maturity and that's wisdom. And those are a beautiful combination.
Yeah, it's so true. One of the reasons I was so interested in you and the conversations we always have are like
Mm,
straight to the deep part of the well,
yeah.
which is great. But one of the reasons I was really intrigued by your story is the fact that you didn't just choose to research something, you chose to live it. And I think that more researchers should do that because I feel the depth of your understanding and your ability to relate that is not built on observation, it's built on existential experience. And I love that. And
Mm,
so I just wanted to say that because for those that may not know, um, maybe you can just briefly talk about what you did in New Zealand in terms of your run. I'm sure our audience would love that, being a lot of them are endurance athletes, no doubt.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a place for everything in science, really. We need all the data. So, because the human experience is so vast. So we need the measurement, we need the like really being in the lab and understanding. And then it just happened to be so that my path is such that I really the data that comes from is from the existential inquiry, and it's called hermeneutic phenomenology is the approach that I'm using, or first person inquiry.
Wow.
It's the qualitative method, and it's really also a way of life, so everything becomes the research. And of course, when you're doing it under the scientific um, rigor, it means that you are going through a process where you are tracking everything and you are critically examining it, so it's not just kind of like writing an autobiography. But so yeah, first of all, I found this research topic through a personally experienced tragedy and trauma. So it didn't just kind of come to me as like, oh, I'm interested in this. I've always had an interest towards psychology and the human mind. So that's the starter. But when I was living in New York City, and this is now 10 and a half years ago, and I was in a relationship that was first emotionally very abusive, but then it also became physically extremely abusive. And I nearly lost my life in that situation. And then when the relationship was over, my boyfriend got deported from the US, and I started this long journey to healing. So what happened was I really started asking this question that how did I survive and how am I surviving? How am I able to begin anew and mend after such a trauma and break of trust, in an intimate relationship? And and I also realized what a massive global unspoken issue it is, and it covers all forms of abuse. It's also at the office. When we don't allow people their full expression, we're pushing other people down, and what we really need is our cultures of compassion where we respect one another. So it's a very, very broad concept. But so it took me to ask these questions on how do humans overcome extreme adversity, and that really truly is the number one and the first question with which I came into this journey now that I've been on since 2013, really, as a researcher. And um, and there is a concept from psychology that I do want to mention because I think it might be very enticing to many of our listeners, and it is called this concept of post-traumatic growth. It's coined, the term is coined by researcher Richard Tedeschi, if someone wants to find a couple of research papers. So instead of just the post-traumatic stress that we keep hearing about, there's an other side to the coin, where what Richard noticed as a clinical psychologist, that when people go through extreme adversities and then with enough time, resources, they start healing, they don't merely come back to the base level, that they grow often in just stunning ways. And there is this clarification of our life goals. There's this deepening of our sense of meaning and purpose, deepening of a sense of compassion for other people and their suffering. So I went through a massive divider like that. So there's life post-trauma and there's life pre-trauma for me, before and after. And that led me on this adventure where first I quit the job that I was in. I didn't really find meaning in that anymore. I was working for the Finnish government in New York, and I got accepted to this master's program by the founder of the field of positive psychology, Martin Seligman. It was a master's in that applied form of psychology, and I got into Sisu. Naturally came to me because it's from my own native culture, and there was no research on it, even though we've had it for hundreds of years. And so that became a path. And then at some point, as we veer into these less known spaces of our psyche and soul, and when we surrender to this more intimate dialogue with her and him, and it can start asking questions from us, you know. And the question from me, from my soul, was that, okay, Emilia, you're researching this quality that relates to determination and courage and this fire of the heart and soul and belly, like, but you haven't done the most courageous thing in your life. So I was put on the spot, you know. And for me, it was just tell my story back in the day, like how it happened, and open up about the relationship, and because I carried so much shame around it, you know. And the shame should never be on the victim. And so I shared the story, and that opened a whole new path. I ended up founding a nonprofit called Sisu, not Silence, which is about the idea to break the silence around these all these topics that we carry shame around, and that put us in this internal prison. And for that, I wanted to do the most audacious, badass thing I could possibly imagine to kickstart the nonprofit. And I was reminded of a dream that I had. Not, you know, like I was having a nap sometime in 2011. And in that dream, I was running across this beautiful green country. And I knew somehow, the dream, that it was New Zealand. And I was carrying a flag for everyone who's ever gone through situations like abuse. I never thought I would actually go and implement or manifest something like that. But, you know, at that point, I was reminded of the dream. And, you know, in the beginning, it truly never occurred to me that I shouldn't do it. It's 2000. The goal was 1,500 miles. So 2,400 or so kilometers in 50 days. It was an arbitrary number that came to my mind, the 50 days to run it. So it's 50 ultra marathons in 50 days. I was not an athlete at the time. I had previous background in having run one marathon 10 years before that, and then one marathon 5 years or something before that, and then had a pretty sedentary year and a half leading up to it. And so it seemed like an impossible dream to go into such thing. And there were coaches who said that, Emilia, you literally physically can't do that because you're not an ultra endurance athlete. Like your ligaments won't hold, first of all. And the thought in my mind, and this is where we come to the Perpetuating Sisu as well, because in addition to being this internal fortitude, Sisu is also what I call an action mindset. It's in my research paper that anyone can go. It's open access. You'll find it with embodied fortitude. It'll come up with that, and you can just download it. And so that's one of the three themes that I described there for Sisu, which is action mindset, which means to lean into, it's having a consistent, courageous approach toward challenges. It's that thing that happens when we go into, it's uphill, it's the headwind, that is the tendency we have to shy away and turn back, almost like as a reflection, or do we lean in? And people with Sisu, high amounts of it, they tend to go in. You could even call this, maybe it has something to do with the dopamine receptor D4, DRD4, which has been identified with people who are entrepreneurs, for example, that they have this ability to kind of dive in, and it's very natural for them. So I've had that always. And so I didn't really start questioning myself, the first thing, but the thing that came to my mind was, well, there's only one way to find out, and it is to try it and go into the experience. And I trained for it in 2 years. We fundraised for it to organize events in each city to talk about compassionate cultures, and it turned to be one of the adventures of my lifetime. 50 deaths and 50 rebirths, I would call them.
Amelia, that is, yeah, it was an amazing journey. And you touched on something that I really want to talk about, this whole piece on uh, micro actions and perpetuating positivity and what that actually means.
Well, I like your concept, the micro actions. And for more than, yeah, and we can say positivity because positivity and positive attitude is actually one of the most researched qualities that we can associate with resilience and our ability to keep on going when it's tough. Because positivity means that we're able to reach out and reach into some kind of idea in the future, and then start moving towards it. I think was Aristotle said something like the soul never dreams or thinks without an image, something like that. The soul never thinks without an image. And being able to tap into that positive reserve within us, again, it goes into that Barbara Fredrickson's topic of being able to access more of those cognitive qualities that we have within us already. We all have them. So there is really no, I'm not super keen on this idea of speaking about superhumans, as in like some people are just somehow so superior.
That's
Because
right.
Sisu and these qualities, they're all as factory settings within every single human. And that's where our mindset comes into play. And positivity, for a great part, is a mindset. It's like, what do we cultivate? What are the thoughts? And everything to me always leads back to our thinking. How do we frame things? One practical way to work on our thinking, if we notice that we have negative patterns, that we immediately go into the what could go wrong, is called positive reappraisal. That we can take any situation that comes our way and change our perspective just a little bit. It doesn't have to be something so extreme, and personally I can't even do this, go from fear or anxiety into excitement and happiness. I mean, it rarely works like that. And that might be a superpower if anyone has that. But what I often do is, okay, I can ask myself that, what can I learn from this situation? I can rather easily now switch from fear to curiosity. Like, I can open a little tiny thread under the door for that, and that allows my mind to come out of this downward spiral, which is the opposite of having the optimistic. I like to use the word optimism before positivity because it's a little bit less kind of polarizing, because positivity for me goes into that happiness thing. And we don't need to be experiencing exuberant feelings of happiness to be able to be high functioning and go through these experiences. There's actually quite a lot of research on the difference between happiness and meaning. And to those listeners who are parents, this might ring a bell. Is that in one of these research papers and studies that I read, parents oftentimes report, especially at some points of the growth curve of the child or the baby, quite low levels of happiness, but they report high levels of meaning. So there's a difference between these
Mm.
dynamics of the.
That's a really interesting piece there, that what gives us meaning doesn't necessarily always make us functionally happy in the moment, right? That's so interesting.
Yeah, it was
I'll
definitely.
go
Yeah,
ahead. Sorry.
I was definitely like in New Zealand because it was such a long journey to, and for the ultra runners and ultra people there, it's really the first day when I started, I had to already think about my recovery, not just the next day or the next week, but next month. So, and that is a principle also. What the person with mature inner fire and mature Sisu will do is that we don't just blast everything out, but there's a part of our consciousness who's kind of, an algorithm that's tracking, like, what's the healthy level of Sisu? Where is the place where we still, there's aliveness? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, that the line between healthy Sisu and then when it becomes force, and this is a very familiar concept from Taoism, for those who are familiar with it, is to allow our lives to align with that what naturally is alive. And it's called Wu in Taoism, which is called the action of no action, or effort of no effort, which is a little bit misleading as a translation, because there's nothing passive about Wu. It's really surrendering full on to the flow, but it's never forceful. And that's where oftentimes people with high levels of Sisu can damage themselves. That, someone once said that there's two troubles with humans: that we don't know how to get started, and then we don't know how to stop.
I definitely like that. And this whole, yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. And I think that we could definitely overdo it. And I think that again, to the piece earlier, for me, the harder thing many times is doing nothing at all. And I too am approaching 40. And I think that maybe it's something that's kind of indicative of where I'm at.
Yeah. So kind of back to babies and children, which is always such a lovely topic, isn't it so curious and interesting, as when we're born into this world and we have our caretaker, and then when the baby, she or he is feeling or expressing distress, and she starts crying and is cranky, the first thing that the mother or father does is not that, uh, it doesn't go and ask the baby, like, how are you doing? It's like, it doesn't go into psychoanalysis about it. But the mother or the father immediately first checks that, has the baby been sleeping? Has he been eating? Are the nappies wet? So we start our lives by being very embodiedly attuned and also cared for, and those connections within us to recognize our bodily sensations are naturally affirmed. But then something happens, we start getting into, in our growth, into the space of more the cognitive, things start to become more about the mind, which technically, we could bring in the Cartesian mind body divide here, which, whenever we start elevating something at the expense of the other quality, we go into a place of imbalance. And that's kind of where we are right now as cultures, is that we have elevated the mind at the expense of the body, whereas in the world of the mind and body, there are no distinctions like that. They're working in pure systemic, organic, super organic kind harmony. There's no competition which one is better. But we as humans, we have elevated the mind so much that we've lost in touch with what happens in the body. And it might even be a new thing for some of the listeners that we have a brain in our gut. I mean, it's getting, finally, it's more common, and but still, like 10 years ago, I don't think a lot of people knew about it. For me, I think I heard about it in 2012 the first time, and yet I've been living with this gut brain my entire life. And it's actually, evolutionarily, it's the first brain that evolves and develops. And why it's called the brain is because its structure, it resembles the brain that we have in our skull, and it has the 100 million neural connections, and it's alive, it's transmitting information. And one of the interesting pieces of knowledge that we know from research is that the highway, the neural highway, the vagus nerve, which is also connected to the rest and digest, and the part of us that we feel peaceful. And we can actually activate the vagus nerve, by the way, when we want to find more calmness. It runs on our left side. It's the 10th cranial nerve. It's on the left side of our body. And what I do sometimes when I feel very agitated or anxious, I can simply put my hand on my left shoulder and just tenderly squeeze myself a little bit and just say, it's okay. Like, that allows us physically neurally to calm ourselves, and that's the vagus nerve. And the piece that I was about to share was that the information going between the brain in our skull and then the gut brain, traditionally we've thought that the brain calls all the shots, and it's the control deck and command center. But what research has actually found is that 80% of all the information on that vagus nerve highway is going from the gut to the brain, which kind of puts information delivery wise the gut actually in a superior position. Not that we want to go into then in the future elevating the gut over everything else, but the point is to bring balance to it. And the curious thing about it is what we're learning from research is that, well, how does nutrition influence the gut health, the gut flora and the fauna? There's been research where they took the gut material from timid line of mice, like timid mice, and they planted it inside a lineage of mice that were very courageous and bold. And what happened was that those mice became very timid and fearful. So what we have going on there in the gut and the kind of nutrition we put in, what we eat, it can have huge influences also in our, let's say, experienced levels of courage in your Sisu. So I don't have the research on that yet, or that's not my line that I would do. So we don't have the research on that yet, but that will be very, very interesting when we get to those questions and topics.
It's a big issue because, I would say as a species, we're one of the few, if only species, to have this element of ego, which separates us not only from our body, but nature. And the challenge we're having as societies is society in successful societies are predicated generally on humanity conquering environments and competing, and I know that there's a shift in human awareness is increasing. It's imperative for the success of our species and continuity of our species, not just on an individual level as you and I are talking about, but on a collective level. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And my body resonated to the word when you said that it's imperative. Like I really felt a deep yes to it, that it is not just something, that's going to be good for us as a humanity to find that way. How do we reconcile, the human family and what's going on? And, to find a way how we realize that we are part of a large, massive ecosystem. And it is not just good for us. It is imperative. It's a necessity, And so finding more of the tools that allow us, because it starts with every single human. We can't kind of get past ourselves. I won't feel connected to you or someone else before I am connected to myself. And that's kind of beautiful because I carry my research lab with me everywhere I go. Like I'm always at the center of that thing. And it also is the birth of personal responsibility, that I, as nice as it might feel sometimes to escape that responsibility and point fingers at others, may it be some kind of authority, may it be, another human or a system, that will actually not get me anywhere. But me, doing the things that I need to do with regards to my developmental stage, that's where the beauty lies and the potential and the opportunity.
Emilia, what is learned helplessness? I found that concept fascinating, and how can we actually work to improve our narratives?
Yeah. So learned helplessness in a way, and this is not an official statement, but kind of intuitively, I would even say like it's kind of there at the opposite spectrum of Sisu. Like if the other end is action mindset, that you have a sense of autonomy and you feel that you can influence your future. So learned helplessness is the other, is the opposite. And it was the concept was coined by Dr. Martin Seligman, who's the founder of positive psychology as well. And I think it was already back in the 1970s, and it was his breakthrough research. What they learned is that that humans and animals, when they are in a situation where they start feeling like that their actions don't matter, that if you try something, it doesn't really create a ripple in your environment and nothing changes, well, they start refraining from even trying. And many of these kinds of these mindsets of I'm lacking an English word right now, but of inferiority, and lack of self-efficacy come into play, and then we stop trying.
Yeah, that's a huge one.
Mm.
It really is. And I think narratives are so important. I think that when I'm talking to an individual and I'm looking at their capacity, I'm really trying to unpick their narrative and where they're at. And that will tell me their capacity for growth at that moment in time. I would like to talk about William James. I am a massive fan. I came across his work when I first got sober around this piece on second wind.
Yeah.
Can we talk about that?
Yeah. And so William James is one of my spiritual muses, like that's the energy that I really, really just enjoy. And I love that you mentioned his name because I just thought of him 10 seconds ago. And so William James, he was a philosopher, pragmatist. He's often quoted as being the founder of American psychology or the Western psychology. And one of the books that I would recommend to any listener, because he wrote these massive, massive books that are hundreds and hundreds of pages, which can be quite tedious to go through. But there's a book specifically that speaks to me, and it's around this topic of second wind, and you can download it as a PDF, and it's called The Energies of Men. And so I would definitely recommend that one. And William James, so he was a Harvard scholar and a professor. I think he got accepted to Harvard like at the age of 12 or something like that. And he lived his own life was not easy at all. He went through these massive bouts of depression and all kinds of things, but he was a very caring soul. And he was constantly on this path of experimenting and experiential research. And what comes to my mind constantly now, so I'll bring that. So there's a line from one of his research papers where he speaks about this topic of second wind and this energy that we all have that can be accessed through crisis, really. And he also says, and he kind of refers to this topic of learned helplessness, which is maybe why I started thinking about William James, where we become kind of flat, that we don't even go near our potential with life force and energy. And our lights are dampened, we're kind of just like fiddling around with this power that we have. And there's a line that speaks to me, which is that we need to get rid of the habit of inferiority to our full selves. The habit of inferiority to our full selves. And there's a key word there, which is that a habit, it's not a quality or an essence that someone is not good at something or someone lacks sisu or anything. It's kind of like in learned helplessness. There's the word, it's learned through life experiences. At some point we form a narrative and we learn ways of responding in a way that make us shy away and make us turn away from the potential that is within us. And for me to speak from it with such a low voice, it's really because I saw that so personally in me by training to do the impossible thing. And I call that my initiation, and I really recommend for every woman and man to feel into what could be your initiation. What is it to you? And the point here isn't that, to run a length of a country or do something which is out of this world, because the pathway, when we go from that place where we go beyond the boundary what we think is possible, that in itself is actually same for everyone. There's a line by the founder of Aikido, Morihei Ueshiba, which goes that there are many paths that lead to top of Mount Fuji. So there are different ways to get there, and the point is to go into that space that allows us to challenge those habits of inferiorities that we have, and use that as our initiation to the full expressed, self-actualized, self-realized human. And with William James, because he was also suicidal at some point around the age of 30, and as the story goes, what I read was that he had kind of gone through a place where he wanted to really end his life, that he was so just consumed by anxiety and lack of life will. And he decided to do an experiment that for a period of time, whenever this dark thought would come, the inferiority, the sadness that I can't do, the desperation, he would simply say one thing, one sentence, which is, I can change. And he would start experimenting with this idea that I can change. And I think that is something that I also have used at some point, because it takes me out of that downward spiral where the thoughts become overpowering and overwhelming. So,
and it also touches and leads into, through action I can shift my mindset, my attitude.
exactly.
There is always a way that we can act our way into feeling and being different. I think that's important. We aren't helpless, are we?
No, we are not helpless, but sometimes we always can get into like almost like a trance. We get into this trance of things aren't working, and a trance of just lack of energy. And I can see it with sometimes when a dog starts barking, and it barks first because there's a reason, there's an intruder or it gets spooked by something. But then sometimes you see that dogs are just like, they just get into this, like their mindset where they're just like bark, 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 bark. And what's needed sometimes is a little, like something that yanks them out of it. It's like you say something or you knock something, and the dogs often look like, hey, whoa, what just happened? That they come out of this like automation. And that's the power of having a power line, like I can change, or like whatever. It's very personal for everyone to find kind of almost like a central organizing concept. So we have so many tools. It's really just the bottleneck. What I've observed is often that we just forget that we have them, and we forget that we have the Sisu.
We get enclosed in our own subjectivity.
Yes.
And that's the challenge. And I think when, my good friend and mentor will he says to me, he says, when you're not alive to facts, you're not living, because you're enclosed in your own subjectivity. And it's so true. And what you're saying is that we need to develop tools that can kind of immediately pull us out of it. And I totally agree. The William James piece, I came across him when I got sober through this book of religious experiences or religious varieties of different experiences or something. And it talked about spirituality, and it said, spirituality, it talked about spirituality of the educational variety, not like this burning bush religious style moment. And that many of us come to spirituality through an education piece. And how true that is, not only with spirituality, but with habits and behavior change. It's an educational piece. And I think that we need to remember that when we're embarking on any shift, we need to first educate, indoctrinate ourselves into what we're trying to do. And what then occurs in my experience is the journey then goes from my head to my heart and then into implementation.
Yeah. And that's the longest road we often take.
It's totally
the mind to the body and to the heart.
As they say, it's the journey without distance.
Yeah.
Right. But no, that was there was definitely something that I wanted to talk about, and I think we'll wrap it up there, Emilia. I really loved our time together, loved our conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the Ultra Habits show. I really would like you to let our listeners know where to find you if they want to learn more, please.
And thank you, RJ, so much. I love how we share so much, like there's this commonality between how we think about things. So there's really opened a space where we got to jam a bit, on these topics.
That's right.
So, and thank you to listeners. And I'm very approachable, so I really welcome questions and ideas and whatever might come to your mind. So most easily to reach out to me directly is through my website, which is, you can, for example, go to sisulab.com. So Sisu is spelled SISU, sisulab.com. And there's you can contact me and I read the messages that come from there. And also, I think mostly Instagram, which is my name and last name, Emilia Lahti official. But all those links are actually on my website. So maybe just mentioning sisulab.com is the easiest, and all the handles. So you can choose whatever you want from Facebook to Instagram and Twitter. So.
Well, Emilia, I again really want to thank you for your time. We'll have to do another session again. I know we have so many different topics that we really could and should dive into. And yeah, I definitely feel a connection with you as soon as we spoke. So we will be in touch, to be continued. Thank you so much again for your time.
Beautiful. Thank you, RJ.